know it's still the same day. My goal is to like read the whole book today and tape it, but we'll see how that goes. It's like 10:45 right now in the morning, and I've been doing this since I think 6, 7, something like that. All right, so today we are going to read chapter 18 and chapter 19. Okay, so the tall Indian, there's a picture. All right, and the other one is called Santa Claus. Okay, here we go. In those 3 days, the norther, yes, it is norther. It's not northerner. It's just norther. Okay, it's probably like a storm when we would have in Maine. It's called a nor'easter, not a northeaster, but a nor'easter. So it's a norther. Okay, let's start again. All right, in those 3 days, the northern had howled and screeched across the prairie till it blew itself out. Now the sun was warm and the wind was mild, but there was a feeling of autumn in the air. Remember, autumn's another word for fall. The Indians came riding on the path that passed close to the house. They went by as though it were not there. They were thin and brown and bare. They rode their little ponies without saddles or bridles. They sat up straight on the naked ponies and did not look to the right or the left. But their black eyes glittered. Laura and Mary backed against the house and looked them up and down. And they saw red-brown skin bright against the blue sky, and sackcloth wound with red-colored strings and feathers quivering. The Indians' faces were like red-brown wood that Pa had carved to make a bracket for Ma. I thought the trail was an easy one. They didn't use it. Was an old one they didn't use anymore, Pa said. I wouldn't have built the house so close to it if I'd known it's a high road. Okay, that means like a highway, a high road. Jack hated them going past his house, and Ma didn't blame him. She said, I declare, they are getting so thick around here that I can't look up without seeing an Indian. As she spoke, she looked up, and there stood an Indian. They stood in the doorway looking at them, and they had not heard a sound. Oh! Ma gasped. Silently, Jack jumped at the Indian. Pa caught him by his collar just in time. Remember, he said there'd be a lot of trouble if Jack bit an Indian. Okay, so Pa caught him before that could happen. The Indian hadn't moved. He stood as still as if Jack hadn't been there at all. Whoa! He said to Pa. Pa held on to Jack and replied, Oh! He dragged Jack to the bedpost and tied him there. While he was doing it, the Indian came in and squatted down by the fire. Then Pa squatted down by the Indian, and they sat there, friendly but not saying a word, while Ma finished cooking dinner. Laura and Mary were close together and quiet on their beds in the corner. They couldn't take their eyes off the Indian. He was so still that the beautiful eagle feathers on his scalp didn't stir. Only his chest moved as he breathed a little. He wore fringed leather leggings, and his moccasins were covered with beads. Probably like the beads they found, right? Ma gave Pa and the Indian their dinner on 2 tin plates, and they ate silently. Then Pa gave the Indian some tobacco for his pipe. They filled their pipes, and they lit the tobacco with coals from the fire, and they silently smoked until the pipes were empty. All this time nobody had said anything. But now the Indian said something to Pa. Pa shook his head and said, No speak. A while longer they all sat silent. Then the Indian rose up and went away without a sound. My gracious, Ma said. Laura and Mary ran to the window. They saw the Indian straight back riding away on the pony. He held a gun across his knees. Its end stuck out on either side of him. Pa said that the Indian was no commoner. He guessed by the scalp lock that he was an Osage. Unless I miss my guess, Pa said, that was French he spoke. I wish I had picked up some of that lingo. Let Indians keep themselves to themselves, said Ma, and we will do the same. I don't like Indians around underfoot. Pa told her not to worry. That Indian was perfectly friendly, he said. And their camps down among the bluffs are peaceful enough. If we treat them well and watch Jack, we won't have any trouble. The very next morning, when Pa opened the door to go up to the stable, Laura saw Jack standing in the Indian trail. He stood stiff. His back bristled and all his teeth showed. Before him in the path was a tall Indian on his pony. Indian and pony were still as still. Jack was telling them plainly that he would spring if they moved. Only the eagle feathers that stood from the Indian's scalp lock were waving in the spinning of the breeze. When the Indian saw Pa, he lifted his gun and pointed it straight at Jack. Laura ran to the door, but Pa was quicker. He stepped between Jack and that gun, and he reached down and grabbed Jack by the collar. He dragged Jack out of the Indian's way, and the Indian rode on along the trail. Pa stood with his feet wide apart, his hands in his pockets, and watched the Indian riding farther and farther away across the prairie. That was really close, Pa said. Well, it's his path, an Indian trail long before we came. He drove an iron ring into a log of the house wall and chained Jack to it. After that, Jack was always chained. He was chained to the house in the daytime, and at night he was chained to the stable door because horse thieves were in the county now. They stole Mr. Edwards' horse. Jack grew crosser and crosser because he was chained, but it could not be helped. He would not admit that the trail was the Indian's trail. He thought it belonged to Pa, and Laura knew that something terrible would happen if Jack hurt an Indian. Winter was coming now. The grasses were a dull color under the dull sky. The winds wailed as if they were looking for something they could not find. Wild animals were wearing their thick winter coats, and Pa set his traps in the creek bottom. Every day he visited them, and every day he went hunting. Now that the nights were freezing cold, he shot deer for meat. He shot wolves and foxes for their furs, and his traps caught beaver and muskrat and mink. He stretched the skins on the outside of the house and carefully tacked them there to dry. In the evenings he worked and the dried skins between his hands to make them soft, and he added them to the bundle in the corner. Every day the bundle of furs grew bigger. Laura loved to stroke the thick fur of red foxes. She liked the brown, soft fur of beaver, too, and the shaggy wolf's fur. But best of all, she loved the silky mink. Those were all furs that Pa saved to trade next spring in Independence. Laura and Mary had rabbit skin caps, and Pa's cap was muskrat. One day when Pa was hunting, 2 Indians came. They came into the house because Jack was chained. Those Indians were dirty and scoury and mean. They acted as if the house belonged to them. One of them looked through Ma's cupboard and took all the cornbread, and the other took Pa's tobacco pouch. They looked at the pegs where Pa's gun belonged. Then one of them picked up the bundle of furs. Ma held baby Carrie in her arms, and Mary and Laura stood close to her. They looked at the Indians taking Pa's furs. They couldn't do anything to stop him. He carried them as far as the door. Then the other Indian said something to him. They made harsh sounds at each other in their throats, and he dropped the furs. They went away. Ma sat down, hugged Mary and Laura close to her, and Laura felt Ma's heart beating. Well, Ma said, she smiled, I'm thankful they didn't take the plow and seeds. Laura was surprised. She asked, what plow? The plow and all our seed for next year are in the bundle of furs, said Ma. When Pa came home, they told him all about those Indians, and he looked sober. That means kind of like sad or concerned, yeah. But he said that was all well but he said all's well that ends well. That evening, when Mary and Laura were in bed, Pa played his fiddle. Ma was rocking in the rocking chair, holding baby Carrie against her, and she began to sing softly with the fiddle. Wild roved an Indian maid, bright Alphatah, when flow the waters of the blue Junita. Strong and true my arrows are in my painted quiver. Swift goes my light canoe adown the rapid river. Bold is my warrior good, the love of Alphatah. But proud wave in sunny plumes along the Junita. Soft and low he speaks to me, and then his war cry sounding, rings his voice in thunder loud, from height to height resounding. So sang the Indian maid, bright Alphatah, where sweep the waters of the blue Junita. Fleeting years have borne away the voice of Alphatah, still flows the waters of the blue Junita. Ma's voice and Pa's fiddle music softly died away, and Laura asked, where did the voice of Alphatah go, Ma? Aren't you asleep yet? Ma said. I'm going to sleep, Laura said. But please tell me where the voice of Alphatah went. Oh, I suppose she went west, Ma said. That's what the Indians do. Why do they do that, Ma? Laura asked. Why do they go west? They have to, Ma said. Why do they have to? The government makes them, Laura, said Pa. Now go to sleep. May I? He played the fiddle softly for a while. Then Laura asked, please, Pa, can I just ask one more question? What is it? Pa answered. I missed it. May I? Said Ma. Laura began again. Pa, please may I? What is it? Pa asked. It was not polite for little girls to interrupt, but of course Pa's could do it. Will the government make these Indians go west? Yes, Pa said. When white settlers come into a country, the Indians have to move on. The government is going to move these Indians farther west any time now. That's why we're here, Laura. White people were going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we got here first to take our pick. Now, do you understand? Yes, Pa, Laura said. But Pa, I thought this was Indian territory. Won't it make the Indians mad to have to? No more questions, Laura, Pa said firmly. Go to sleep. Just think about the Indians. Now they have to leave their house. So there they are. Okay, Mr. Edwards meets Santa Claus. The days were short and cold. The wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. cold rains falling day after day. The rain fell pattering on the roof and pouring from the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close by the fire, sewing their 9-patch quilt blocks or cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper and hearing the wet sound of rain. Every night was so cold that they expected to see snow next morning, but in the morning they saw only sad, wet grass. They pressed their noses against the squares of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad to see out, but they wished they could see snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in Indian Territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know. "What date is it?" they asked her anxiously. "How many days till Christmas?" And they counted off the days on their fingers till there was only one day left. Rain was still falling that morning. There was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. The clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in a clear blue sky. The sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sparkled on the grasses. But Ma opened the door and let in the fresh, cold air. They heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew there would be no Christmas, because Santa Claus could not cross a roaring creek. Pa came in bringing a big fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said, he'd eat feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of those drumsticks?" She said yes, she could, but she was sober. Again, remember that means kind of sad, kind of, yeah, I can. Okay. Then Mary asked him if the creek was going down, and he said it was still rising. Ma said it was too bad. She didn't like to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to Christmas dinner with them, but Pa shook his head and said a man who risks his neck trying to cross the creek now is crazy. "No," he said, "that current's too strong for him to cross. We'll just have to make up our minds that Mr. Edwards won't be here tomorrow." Of course, that meant that Santa Claus could not come either. Mary and Laura tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by, and such a turkey for Christmas. Ma said so, and it was true. I'm going to move a second. Sorry. I'm in troubles. Okay. Ma said it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but they were such good little girls that he hadn't forgotten them. He would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and face, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They lay down in bed and pulled the covers up. It did not seem at all like Christmas. Pa and Ma sat silently by the fire. After a while, Ma asked why Pa didn't play the fiddle, and he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Caroline." After a while, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls," she said. "Maybe something will happen." Laura's heart jumped. But then she thought again of the creek and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on each side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed. Now go to sleep, Ma said, kissing them good night. Morning will come quicker if you're asleep. She sat down again by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, "You've only made it worse, Caroline." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar." But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door latch rattled, and someone said, "Ingalls! Ingalls!" Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. "Great fish hooks, Edwards! Come in, man! What's happened?" Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stockings limply dangling, and she scrooged her eyes shut into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. There he is. See? His clothes are on his head as he's crossing the very rushing creek. "It's too big a risk, Edwards," Pa said. "We're glad you're here, but that was too big a risk for a Christmas dinner." "Your little ones have to have a Christmas," Mr. Edwards replied. "No creek could stop me after I fetched them their gifts from Independence." Laura sat straight up in bed. "Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Mr. Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried. Not like, "ooh," but like, "ah!" They were, saying it out loud. That's another way of saying it excitedly is cried. Okay? Wait a minute," Mr. Edwards laughed. "And Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings as Santa Claus intended. She said they mustn't look." Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their beds, and he answered every question they asked. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said, he had known that Santa Claus could not get across. "But you crossed it," Laura said. "Yes," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He can't make it, whereas I, lean, razorback like me, could do so." Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no farther south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course, he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. "In the rain?" Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street in Independence, he had met Santa Claus. "In the daytime?" Laura asked. She hadn't thought of anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. "No," Mr. Edwards said. "It was night, but lights shone out across the street from the saloons." "Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, 'Hello, Edwards!'" "Did he know you?" Mary asked and Laura asked. How did he know you? He was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he had recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest, whitest set of whiskers west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards! Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a cornstalk bed in Tennessee." And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa had left him for him. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living down on the Verdigris River. Have you ever met up down yonder with two little girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "It rests heavily on my mind," said Santa. "They are both of them sweet, pretty, good little young things, and I know they are expecting me. I sure don't want to disappoint two good little girls like them. Yet, with the water up the way it is, I can't ever make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year. Edwards," Santa Claus said, "would you do me the favor to fetch them their gifts this one time?" "I'll do that with pleasure," Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where the pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he can't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. "Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest, and Santa Claus uncinched the pack and looked through it, and he took out the presents for Mary and Laura." "Oh, what are they?" Laura cried, but Mary asked, "Then what did he do?" Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. "So long, Edwards," he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge trail, leading the pack mule and whistling. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of that. Then Ma said, "You may look now, girls." Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary. But Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. They knew tin cups were these new tin cups were their very own. Now they don't have to share. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again, and they pulled out two long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just one lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take one lick of her stick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out two small packages. They unwrapped them and each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sparkling white sugar. They sparkled grains lay like little snowdrifts. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura looked at them. But at last, Laura turned hers over and she nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath, wherever it wouldn't snow. And the inside of the little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary never could have looked in their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak, but Ma asked if they were sure their stockings were empty. Then they put their arms down inside them to make sure. But in the very toe of each stocking was a shiny, bright new penny. They had never even thought of such a thing as having a penny. Think of having a whole penny for your very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. There never had been such a Christmas. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing the lovely presents all the way from Independence. But they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They had even forgotten Santa Claus. In a minute they would have remembered. But before they did, Ma gently said, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards, thank you," they said, and they meant it with all their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hand too, and shook it again. Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying. Laura didn't know why, so she gazed again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped. There Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they had helped to balance the packages on his head when he was swaying across the creek. When he swam across the creek. He thought Pa and Ma might like them with the Christmas turkey. There were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too, and it was just too much. Pa said so. "It's too much, Edwards," he said. They never could thank him enough. Mary and Laura were too much excited to eat breakfast. They drank the milk from their shiny new cups, but they could not swallow the rabbit stew or the cornmeal mush. "Don't take them, Charles," Ma said. Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It'll soon be dinner time." For Christmas dinner there was a tender, juicy roasted turkey. There were the sweet potatoes, baked in the ashes and carefully wiped off so that they could eat the skins too. There was a loaf of salt rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there was stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made of brown sugar, and they did not have white sugar sprinkles on their tops. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank water out of their new cups, and little by little they licked and sucked their sticks of candy till each stick was sharp pointed on one end. That was a happy Christmas. And that is all for today. Bye-bye, guys.